The second song that we sang this morning, the second verse, it says, sometimes, mid scenes of deepest gloom, sometimes where Eden's bowers bloom, by waters still, over troubled sea, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be. Now I hope you noticed those were contrasts. Sometimes when you're very happy, but sometimes life is deep as gloom. Sometimes the waters are peaceful, and sometimes the waters of life are a raging storm. Come what may, you are going to be a follower of Jesus Christ. What happens in those transient times is people sometimes lose their faith. They sometimes were believers, but doubt begins to creep in. Do I really believe that? And it comes from many different sources. So I want to talk this morning just about the nature of doubt and how we can deal with doubt. And it's been my conviction that it happens to all of us to a certain degree. Even preachers, because of things that happen in their lives, they begin sometimes to question what they have believed. And so it was with this father of the young man. And I have trouble wrapping my head around what it would be like for this father. The baby boy is born. What a joy. Diapers and all, sleepless nights and all, he's your boy. And somewhere along the way, all of a sudden, he changes. He no longer can talk. He gets cast down to the ground like an epilepsy fit, only it's not epilepsy. Looks that way. And he rolls on the ground and foams at the mouth, and sometimes will roll into the fire, and sometimes will roll into the water. And you have to rescue him. And he can't help himself. And this happened from his youth. I don't know how young, but from his youth, and for now some time, the father, if it was my son, I'd be praying fervently. I would be asking God, spare the child. And most of us as parents would say, let it happen to me instead. Let me take this, but spare the child. And so the father has heard about Jesus, and he's come seeking because he has heard that Jesus can take care of this. And so he comes, and the disciples are there, but Jesus is not. He'd gone up on the Mount of Transfiguration with some of the apostles, and he'd left the others down here, and he comes to these apostles, and he says, help, cast him out. And they could not. Now, they had done it before back in Matthew chapter 10. Jesus had given them the power to cast out demons, but this particular case, they could not. Can you imagine how exasperated that father would be? How depleted? What would happen to his faith? He believed that Jesus was able to do that, but they can't. But Jesus comes. And when Jesus comes into his presence, he now can begin asking the Father. And Curtis, I gave him two choices, the short version, the longer version, and thank you, Curtis, he picked the longer one. Because I'm going to tell you the end of this. Jesus healed him. Jesus cast out the demon and gave this son back to the Father. And now, the way we would finish the story, they lived happily ever after. I don't know what happened to the son, and we don't know what happened to the father after this. I just know, I am sure they went on their way rejoicing. Wow. But what if Jesus had not come down at that point in time? What if the father had got discouraged and turned around and walked away before Jesus came? And besides, these couldn't help, and they're his followers. And so the man says, if you can. And Jesus responded, if all things are possible if you trust, if you believe in God. And this father cried out what most of us probably have cried out at certain points in our life. I believe, help my unbelief. So as we talk about this, and he read all of this, can you really have doubts? Can you be a believer in God and still have some doubts? Can you actually be convinced and yet have doubts? Now, back about 1990, somewhere in the 90s, some of you weren't born, so I have to tell you what happened. There rose a bunch of atheists that decided to be militant about their atheism. And so they began writing books and getting on the talk shows and putting things on the internet and on TV, denying that there is a God. They even took out and put on the sides of the buses in England, since there is no God, quit worrying. And some people reading that, going through a trying time of their life, would have begun to have doubts. And the atheists began affirming that you can't have doubts. To have faith, you have to be 100% convinced that this is true. I always laugh. That always happens until they go to court and are accused of a crime, and then they want the jury to only come to the probability that it happened, an assurance of the probability, an abundance of the probability, not absolute, and so that they can get off. But not only the atheists, sometimes believers, they become with the idea that if I have any doubts about anything in religion, then I'm not really a believer. That if I have faith, I will never doubt anything. And I'm going to tell you what, that has not been my experience. And that's not been my experience in talking with many, many brethren over the time. But every once in a while, you come to a scripture. Now, Brandon has walked us through the book of James, so I'm just going to go back. It says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. And that's not the normal believer. We sometimes have some doubts, some questions, but we're not double-minded. Now, he's going to use that phrase, double-minded, again when he gets over into chapter 4. And in chapter 4, James says, draw near unto God, and he will draw near unto you. But notice this. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. What we're talking about is those that have faith and are walking with God to the best of their ability, and those that have set up a relationship with the world. They're still in love with the world. Preachers talk about having one foot in the church and one foot in the world. And that's what a double-minded man is. It's not a man that is striving. It's a man that really wants to still be in the world. I told a lady one time, she said, what is my problem? And I said, here's your problem. All the things that God says you're supposed to love, you find boring. And all things that God said don't do that, that's what you love. And so you come to church and you're miserable. She was a double-minded person. And so it's not about whether you have any doubts at all or not. It's about whether or not you're willing to continue to serve, to be faithful unto God. And so what you learn is faith comes in degrees. Now, we read from Mark, but if we would have read that story from Matthew, what happens was the apostles, they gathered Jesus later and they said, why couldn't we cast that demon out? And Jesus gave them a simple statement. Little faith. If your faith was as a grain of a mustard seed, you could. And what you learn from that is that faith comes in degrees. I don't know how to measure faith, by the way. There's little faith and there's great faith. Jesus could say several times to the apostles who were believers, O ye of little faith. And at the same time, to the centurion that came to Jesus, he said, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. Now, I don't know how you measure that. I just know that it grows. You learn to trust by trusting. God asks you to do this, and you don't understand why, but you do it, and maybe 10 years later, 20 years later, you look back and you know exactly why you were supposed to do that. And that genders even more trust and more trust. And so it's a growing process, this works. And yet we're told, if you have faith, there will be no doubts whatsoever. And that's just absolutely not true. Now, it may be true in math. What's 1 plus 1? Well, what if I go to China? What's 1 plus 1? What if I speak Russian? What is 1 plus 1? Now, they have a different word for 1, but they have the same math. That's because that's the way math works. It will always work that way. Even a baby that doesn't know numbers by name. I watched an interesting show. And they did this thing where they had 3 oranges on the box and the little baby was looking at it and they put a box over it and one of the oranges they took away and they raised the box up and now there's not 3 oranges, there's only 2 oranges. And the little infant, though he couldn't say 1, 2, or 3, was trying to see where that 3rd orange went. Why? Because 3 is 3 and it's not 2. No doubts. But our world is not made up of math. Aren't you all glad? I have faith in many things. Faith that the car is going to start. You know, we sometimes wait until the last minute before we have to go to work and we run out and and nothing happens. So we get a new battery and then our faith is reestablished and we know that it's going to start. And then I was just now with my friend and he had a lot more faith in his brakes than I did in him. And we came up and we stopped, but I'm grabbing the seat and holding on. But we all do that. Not that degree, but we trust our brakes. If you knew you had no brakes, you would not drive the car at all. We drive 75 mile an hour down a two-way road. Y'all driven from here to Fort Stockton? And you're doing 75 on this side, and he's coming at you doing 75 on the other side, and you're 3 foot apart. Do you really trust that he's going to stay over there? Do you really trust that your car is not going to just weave over in spite of steering? And the answer is, yeah. But you also realize it might not. But we trust it. And then you do surgery. My dad had open heart surgery back in 2000. They lived in Brady, but they had to come to this hospital in San Angelo. And so my thought was, I didn't know anything about the doctors here. My first thought was, here's a podunk town with a podunk hospital and a podunk doctor, and he's going to have an open heart surgery. And so I went. And I got here the night before, and that doctor walked into the room. And so he was standing there, and I looked at him, and I said, Doc, have you ever done one of these surgeries before? And he didn't even look up. He said, no, but I've read a book. He had a better sense of humor than I did. But what I found out was, before he came here, he was the head doctor of the heart hospital in Houston that was the leading hospital with all of the heart transplants and all of the heart surgery stuff. He had done a few surgeries. And he did my dad's surgery, and my dad then lived for 24 more years. The average lifespan of a heart surgeon is you live another 10 years after the surgery, and my dad more than doubled that. But you know what? We had faith in the doctor. I didn't know whether he'd done any surgeries. I didn't know. But we have faith in the doctors. Not 100%. We know there's a danger. But we have that. Or just buying groceries. Did you all realize there was a major recall of broccoli? That's why I don't eat it. No, we eat it. But there is a danger. We buy food all the time, and we eat it. And sometimes it'll kill you. But we have faith. But with that faith, it's not absolute 100%. It's a preponderance of the evidence. And so we live by faith, trusting God. And it never meant 100%. Do you remember Daniel's 3 friends? Richard, just for you, I put their names up here on the board. Because all I ever remember is Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. Well, that's the way the Father said it. But not their Jewish names. But here they are. And the king makes this golden idol, huge, and demands that when they blow the trumpets that everybody is going to bow. And this is an artist representation, but do y'all realize everybody in that picture is bowing? Not everybody. 3 of them. And the king had declared, if you don't bow down and worship this idol as a god, you will be thrown into the fiery furnace. And these 3 young men stood there. They had faith. But notice the nature of their faith. They responded to the king, if. Do y'all know what the word if means? It's always a conditional thing. It always represents at least 2 outcomes of anything. Sometimes it may be more than 2, but it's always at least 2. If it be our God whom we serve, He is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and He will deliver us out of the hand. But if He does not, there's the other if. If He does not, let it be known to you, O king, we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They believed that God was going to save them. Well, they recognized He might not. But that doesn't make Him any less God. That doesn't change what God had said. That doesn't make the idol into a God. They had faith, but it was not absolute 100% on what God was going to do. Or the book of Esther, where they were plotting to kill all of the Jewish people. And Esther was the queen. And so her uncle encouraged her, go in and tell the king what's happening. And she reminds him, I can't do that. Because there was a law set by the king himself. If you come into my presence when I haven't asked you, you die. She had not been asked. I can't go in unless the king holds out his crown to me. But the uncle said, but if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows? You see, there's always that element in our faith. Who knows? Repeated many times in the Bible by people that had faith, who trusted God. But who knows whether you have not attained royalty or not? Or the book of Job. He lived a righteous, upright life. And then disaster befell him because Satan challenged, and God allowed Satan to bring all of that upon him. But his three friends came and they said, Job, we know you did something bad, really bad, or you wouldn't have this problem. And Job kept saying, I didn't. I don't live that way. I've never lived that way. I didn't do what you're saying. And finally, Job could say that I need to talk with God. I know God will straighten this out. But even if He kills me, I will argue my ways before Him. This is trust. Didn't know whether it was going to work or not, but he believed it would. Had confidence that it would. And so, as we talked in our Bible class this morning, I'm sorry you missed it. I usually throw this in. You should have been here, if you could. But we talked about that. That can I always know exactly when I pray that I have 100% confidence that God's going to do exactly what I've asked Him to do, and you all know that never does work. How many of us have prayed for one of our loved ones and they did not get well? Wow. When I was in high school, my mom and dad had a surprise baby. Surprise. And at 1 year old, she developed uterine cancer. At the time that she did that, it was the 7th recorded instance of that. And we prayed. My folks, anguished. And they did all of the treatments and the radiation and the chemotherapy, and she stayed most of the rest of the 2 years in and out of the hospitals, mostly in, and then she died. My parents, reminds me of the story of David when his son died after he prayed and prayed. My dad made the decision. She's not coming back here, but I can go there. And so he began a deeper religious conviction than he had ever had all the years that I knew him. Eventually, giving up his plumbing job, selling out his business, and went into preaching to travel around Texas preaching and teaching and doing Bible classes. Why? He still trusted God. But God let him down. No, that's life. It's appointed unto man once to die. Some die at 3 years old. Some die like my dad did at 95 years old. Some die like my grandmother did at 102. And I'm going to make 106 just to spite everybody. But I know I'm going to die. But I have faith in God. And I trust. Won't it be wonderful there? And that's our trust. That's our faith on this. And then you study the life of Abraham. And everywhere he went, he trusted in God. But it started over in Hebrews. God spoke to him and said, leave your father, leave your mother, leave your homeland, and come to where I show you. And if you would have been there, you would have probably said, wait a minute, where are we going? But Abraham went not knowing where he was going, but knowing who was leading him. And he trusted God, and he went. And at 75 years old, they had no children. And so God promised him that he would be the father of nations. But he had no children. So he decided to help God out because he didn't know how this was going to work. He trusted what God said, but he went his own way. And so he took the son of a servant of his and said, this will be my son. And God said, no, that's not what I'm doing. So then he turned around and Sarah gave him the handmaid, the female servant, and he raised up a son by the female servant, but it wasn't his wife. And God said, no, it doesn't work that way. Now, do you see something here? Abraham's still trusting God, but he doesn't understand. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know how he's going to have a child. And now he's getting older and older. I turned 75 last year, and I don't want another child. But it ain't going to happen anyway. But Abraham was promised that. And wow. And so we go on down the road, and now Abraham is 99 years old, and God still gives him the promise. And how did he respond to these promises of God? Well, turn to Romans. It is written that God promised, a father of many nations I have made you, in the presence of him whom he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist, in hope against hope. 99 years old, y'all got that? Hope against hope. He believed. He not only believed what God said, he trusted God to do what God said, so that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which had been spoken, so shall your descendants be. And without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb, she was 89. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in the faith, giving glory to God. And then in verse 20 or chapter 21, the Lord did what he promised. Are you all surprised? But I know there had to be doubts along that way. The questions, if you would rather phrase it that way. Not knowing, but I will trust God. And that's where we want to be. The faith is a trust that is based upon what is reasonable, not what is absolutely certain. What's reasonable is God. What's reasonable is God said it. What's reasonable is God, who is omnipotent, can do that which we can't comprehend. Paul said in Ephesians, he's able to do exceedingly, abundantly, above whatever you might even think. Abraham trusted God. God is faithful. So where are the doubts? And reading about this over the years, something that keeps cropping up, and I'm just going to share it with you this morning. Sometimes these doubts come in from an intellectual viewpoint. Sometimes, like the father of this child that we saw in Mark, they come from an emotional standpoint. And sometimes they come from a problem of our will, our moral decisions. The intellectual doubt happens when all of a sudden we learn new facts. Young people going to college, you're going to be bombarded with this. I learned a statistic last week when I was gone that in our universities, the ratio is 95 very liberal professors to every one conservative. That's where our education system is going. And so you will be bombarded with this. And you will begin having questions. What you've been taught, they will deny. What you have learned and trusted, they will deny. And the intellect will be bombarded with this. And your function as a child of God is to be faithful, to continue to trust. When you have all of this information that you are presented with, and then new information, that's an intellectual doubt. Let me come back to how to deal with that. But sometimes it doesn't come from intellect per se, it just comes from an emotional part. My mom and dad dealing with baby sister. The emotions. And when you've prayed and prayed and the child dies, you begin having emotional doubts. That what you wanted, God simply said, no. And we don't understand why. And so our emotions just get turmoiled. And we can begin to question. And that's when we need the faith. We wrap our hearts around some hurt that doesn't make sense. You know what the most common reason for unbelief is? Bad things happen. They happened last night. Kentucky had some floods. It flooded out part of Bowling Green. Earlier this year, we saw the fires that went through. Can you imagine? I don't know if you ever seen this or not. I went through some of the Southern California fire systems. And we could stand outdoor at night and you could see all of the fires around about you. Absolutely frightening. And what you pray about, let it stop. And it doesn't. And the next thing you know, it's 1,000 houses. People lost everything. Do you all think they prayed? Do you all think they hoped? And yet it didn't happen. Or even earlier, the hurricane that blew in and then just set over Tennessee and flooded all these houses and homes and destroyed roads. And it happens. Bad things happen. And when it happens to you, I'm going to tell you what will happen. You will have questions. The most often question is, why? Or more direct, why me? That's when your faith has to kick in. That's when your faith has to be there as an anchor to the soul that keeps it from being ripped apart. So, moral doubt, the last one. Sometimes what God asks us to do is just plain difficult. And I don't want to do it. I would rather do something else, anything else, except what he asked me to do. The rich young ruler, godly man, he came to Jesus and could say, I have kept all of the commandments from my youth on up. And Jesus looked at him and didn't call him a liar. He said he loved him. And then Jesus said, but you lack one thing. You need to sell everything you have, give it away, and come follow me. And this rich young ruler, he went away. He turned around and walked off. Because he had great possessions. And what he was asked to do, he had doubts. This was a moral doubt. Would Jesus really provide more and better than all that I already have? We'll give it away and see. Now, I'm not going to do that. That's a moral doubt. He didn't trust. And so he went away from Jesus. So one of my favorite songs, Bill likes to lead that. Thank you, Bill. Trust and obey. In fact, those two words just have to be tied together. There is no trust if you're not willing to do what God asks. To some ability, to the best of your ability. So trust and obey. In dealing with the intellectual doubt, I've learned something. I don't know everything. Did you all know that? Now, I know I speak confidently all the time about all the things I know, but I'll tell you what I've learned. The more I learn that I don't know. Yesterday, I didn't know that I didn't know about that. But today, I've learned this, and now I realize I don't know anything at all about that. And the more you learn, the more you don't know. And there's where the intellectual doubts begin coming in. Because you're trying to wrap your head around these different facts. And I'm going to tell you the first thing to do is admit, I don't know. But I'm going to find out. I don't know, but I'm going to study about it. I don't know, but I'm going to keep looking. But you know, the fact that I don't know that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. The fact that I don't know doesn't change the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are some things that are just rock bottom. Hold on to that. That doesn't change. That will be the basis that you maintain your faith. And then, I've learned, go seek somebody that knows more than you do. And there are plenty of them. Somebody asked me why I have such a big library. It's because I found there's so many people that know so much more than I do, and they've written books. And I can read books. And I can learn and learn and learn. I bought 3 more books last week. Sharon, you didn't hear that. Now, what happens is, you go and you ask counsel. Go ask somebody that's already been through this. Go ask somebody that you know, knows more about life and about this than you do. But back to where we started, I'm going to tell you, in all of that, remember your faith. Why did you become a believer? I've dealt with people that have lost their faith and have quit. And I've found over the years, I usually go and ask them one question: what really changed? This happened in your life, that means God doesn't exist. This happened in your life, that means Jesus is not raised from the dead. No, it doesn't mean any such thing. It just means that happened in your life and you're struggling with it. What am I going to do with that? Trust God. What if I never get an answer for that and I die? Then you die a believer. Blessed is the death of the faithful. Keep believing. When you have doubts, deal with them. Think about them. Study about them. Talk with people about them. And you can work your way through and come out the other side. But you need to trust God even when life doesn't make a lick of sense. When you think you've figured it out and it's all wrong. No, God is all right. So we trust Him. You know where I first see this problem of faith? People begin believing that they believe in God and they say they believe in Jesus, and then you show them what Jesus said, and Jesus said, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." And all of a sudden, they don't believe. Well, they believe Jesus, but they only believe half. No, believe Jesus. Trust Jesus. Jesus said. Yeah, but it doesn't make any sense to me. How can being dunked in water change anything? Well, I'll give you a really fun story. Back in the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 5, when Naaman came and he wanted to know, why can't I just take a bath up in where I came from? And the answer is because God said you need to dunk 7 times here in this water. And so preachers used to have a lot of fun with that. What was in that water that made Naaman cured from his leprosy? And the answer always came back, Naaman. When he did what God asked, even though it didn't make a lick of sense, there was no evidence to put on it, he had doubts about whether it would work, he put his faith and he did it, and he went away healed. Why does water work in baptism? Because God said so. And it is God that will forgive your sins when you do what He has asked you to do. Do you trust God? Here's the first test for most people. And I've experienced a lot of people just fail the first test. Don't fail. And if you've already done that, I'm going to tell you, life's going to throw you a whole bunch of curves. It's going to throw a bunch of problems your way. But God is, and Jesus is the Son of God. He is my faith and my trust. If you have that trust, we invite you to come respond to this whichever way that you need to, and we will help you with that. Brother Jeff?